At 7:10 local time, the calm over the Persian Gulf shatters. A hatch snaps open on the deck of an American destroyer, and a Tomahawk missile explodes upward in a pillar of flame. For a brief second the sky flashes white. Then the booster drops away, a turbofan roars to life, and the missile tilts forward, skimming east only 50 feet above the waves. 8 seconds later, another launch cell ignites. Then another. Fire blossoms across the deck in precise sequence as missiles slip into the darkness, racing toward a coastline that still believes the morning will be quiet. Inside combat information centers across the fleet, radar screens glow in the dim light. Operators lean forward. Timers begin counting down. Pilots hundreds of miles away push throttles forward as encrypted radios carry short, clipped commands. This isn't a warning shot. It's the opening move of a massive, coordinated operation. Somewhere on Iran's southern coast, a radar operator sips tea while watching an empty scope. He has no idea that dozens of cruise missiles are already threading through gaps in the radar coverage, closing the distance minute by minute. But the missiles racing across the water are only part of the plan, and the most dangerous weapons of the operation are already inside Iranian airspace. Long before the first Tomahawk ever left its launch cell, the battlefield had already begun to change. Hours earlier, small signals had started appearing along Iran's southern radar network. Slow contacts. Weak signatures. Objects moving just above the waterline at barely 100 knots. On the radar screens inside several coastal air defense stations, the shapes looked almost insignificant. But they didn't belong there. Operators zoomed in, adjusting filters, trying to understand what they were seeing. The contacts were too slow to be cruise missiles. Too small to be aircraft. And there were too many of them. Within minutes the first alarm sounded. One battery commander made the decision every air defense officer is trained to make. If something unknown approaches protected airspace, you shoot first. An interceptor launched. The missile tore into the sky, accelerating to several times the speed of sound before smashing into a target no larger than a lawn mower. The radar screen cleared. But the victory was meaningless. Because the drone it destroyed had cost barely $30,000. The interceptor that destroyed it cost more than $1 million. And more drones kept appearing. One after another, Iranian defenses began firing, unaware that every launch was draining their magazines and revealing their exact positions. The real attack hadn't even arrived yet. While Iranian defenses focused on the strange wave of drones approaching their coast, something far more dangerous was already moving into position. Hundreds of miles away, high above western Iraq, a formation of stealth fighters slipped silently through the early morning sky. Their radars stayed dark, their communications minimal. Every aircraft moved according to a timeline calculated down to the second. Behind them, long-range strike fighters carried heavy standoff missiles designed to reach deep into Iran without ever crossing heavily defended airspace. Farther south, American destroyers continued releasing Tomahawk cruise missiles that skimmed across the Gulf, hugging the surface of the water as they threaded through gaps in the radar network. And beyond the horizon, a carrier strike group pushed into the wind as deck crews launched wave after wave of aircraft. None of these forces were operating independently. Every missile, every aircraft, every drone was part of a single synchronized attack network stretching across thousands of miles. Intelligence aircraft watched radar emissions from high altitude while stealth fighters quietly mapped air defense systems below. The goal was simple: force Iranian defenses to fire early, expose their positions, and drain their interceptors just as the real strike packages approached. Because modern warfare isn't just about firepower. It's about timing. And in less than 10 minutes, every piece of the operation would collide at once. Then the clock finally reached zero. Across the region, dozens of weapons that had been moving silently for nearly an hour arrived almost simultaneously. The first impacts came from high above. Long-range standoff missiles plunged toward their targets at supersonic speed, slamming into command compounds and military headquarters before warning systems could react. Windows shattered across entire city blocks as the shockwaves rolled outward. Seconds later, stealth aircraft that had been circling quietly outside radar range crossed the border. Bomb bay doors opened, and precision-guided munitions slipped into the air, gliding silently toward buildings that controlled the backbone of Iran's military network. One bomb pierced the roof of a communications center before detonating deep inside. Another struck a planning complex where operational orders were transmitted across the country. Each impact was calculated, deliberate, aimed not at random destruction but at the nervous system of an entire command structure. Along the Gulf Coast, Tomahawk missiles arrived almost at the same moment. Naval bases erupted into flame as fuel depots ignited and command buildings collapsed inward. Thick black smoke climbed into the sky, visible for miles across the water. Within minutes, radar stations that had been tracking the skies all morning suddenly went dark. Communication links began failing. Units waiting for orders found silence instead. But even as the first wave of strikes unfolded, something troubling remained. Several of Iran's most advanced air defense systems had still not fired. For a few brief minutes, it seemed like the operation had unfolded exactly as planned. Iranian command networks were disrupted, coastal bases were burning, and radar stations across the south had fallen silent. Then, deep in the mountains of western Iran, a new signal appeared. A powerful radar beam cut through the electronic noise, sweeping across the sky with far greater precision than anything earlier that morning. Inside a control bunker carved into the mountainside, Iranian operators had finally brought one of their most advanced air defense systems online. For the first time that day, the aircraft still operating inside Iranian airspace were being actively tracked. Warning tones sounded inside several cockpits as targeting radars began to lock onto incoming strike fighters. The advantage that had defined the operation so far suddenly narrowed. If the system managed to launch its interceptors, several aircraft could be in real danger. But the moment the radar switched to full power, it revealed itself. Electronic warfare aircraft orbiting far to the west detected the emission instantly. Within seconds, powerful jammers flooded the radar frequency with interference, turning the operator's screen into a storm of electronic noise. At the same time, an anti-radiation missile launched from a distant fighter, racing toward the source at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. 90 seconds later, the radar vanished in a flash of fire. With the mountain radar destroyed, the skies over Iran grew quiet again. But the operation was far from finished. The most dangerous phase was only beginning. High above the country, a formation of stealth aircraft continued moving east, almost invisible to the radar systems that remained. These jets were not hunting targets in the traditional sense. Their real weapon wasn't the bombs beneath their wings. It was information. As they cruised silently across the landscape, their sensors listened to everything below. Every radio transmission, every radar pulse, every encrypted signal bouncing between command posts. Tiny electronic fingerprints spread across hundreds of miles. One radar truck that had shut down earlier tried to relocate along a desert highway. Within seconds, the stealth aircraft detected its search signal and quietly marked its position. Far behind them, a strike fighter received the coordinates and turned toward the target. Moments later, a precision-guided bomb erased the vehicle from the road. The pattern repeated again and again. Mobile launchers hiding in valleys. Communication relays buried in remote compounds. Command vehicles attempting to coordinate surviving units. None of them stayed hidden for long. What looked like a chaotic battlefield from the ground was actually a carefully connected network in the sky, where every sensor fed information to the next aircraft in line. And with every signal detected, another target revealed itself. By late afternoon, the battlefield looked very different from the quiet morning that had begun the day. Along Iran's southern coast, naval facilities burned beside dark columns of smoke rising into the sky. Several missile depots that once held hundreds of rockets were now shattered concrete and twisted steel. Warehouses filled with attack drones had been reduced to empty shells. But the most important damage was harder to see. Across large sections of the country, communication networks had gone silent. Command centers struggled to contact units that were no longer receiving orders. Radar systems that once guarded entire regions had disappeared from the screen, leaving gaps that stretched for hundreds of miles. The strikes had not simply destroyed buildings. They had fractured the system that connected Iran's military together. What unfolded that day revealed something far bigger than a single military operation. Modern warfare is no longer decided only by bombs, ships, or fighter jets. It is decided by information, by who sees the battlefield first, who understands it fastest, and who can coordinate thousands of moving pieces at once. Because long before the first missile launches and long after the smoke clears, one truth now defines every modern conflict. The side that controls the information controls the battlefield.